By May 1941, London had endured an ordeal that no city in history had ever faced. For nearly 9 months, the German Luftwaffe had pounded the British capital. At the start of the campaign, in September 1940, they bombed London for 57 consecutive nights. 57 nights. Imagine the psychology of that. You go to work. You come home. You hear the siren. You go into the shelter. You listen to the world ending above you. You come out. You check if your house is still there. You go to work. It became a grim routine. A macabre way of life. The objective of Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring was simple: terror. They believed that if they hit the civilians hard enough, the British working class would rise up. They would demand peace. They would force Churchill to surrender. They targeted the East End, the docks, the slums, the factories. They used high explosives to shatter the buildings and incendiaries to burn the remains. But the German calculation was wrong. Instead of breaking the morale of the Londoners, the bombing hardened it. A strange Blitz spirit emerged. It was a mix of fatalism, humor, and stubborn pride. Shop owners whose windows were blown out would put up signs, "More open than usual." People slept in the tube stations, singing songs to drown out the noise of the anti-aircraft guns. Churchill, the Prime Minister, understood this spirit. He fed it. He visited the bombed-out streets. He cried with the victims. He smoked his cigar and flashed the V for victory a sign. He told them, he, Hitler, has lighted a fire which will burn with a steady and consuming flame until the last vestiges of Nazi tyranny have been burnt out of Europe. But rhetoric doesn't stop bombs. By the spring of 1941, the city was scarred. Thousands were dead. The fire services were exhausted. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF in the Battle of Britain, so they had turned to destroying the city itself. They were trying to murder London. And in the first week of May, they prepared to deliver the death blow. The night of May 10, 1941, was the climax of the Blitz. It was a night chosen with malice. The moon was full. The tides of the River Thames were exceptionally low. The Luftwaffe sent 500 bombers. They carried a mix of high explosives and thousands of incendiary canisters. Their target was not industry. It was the government. It was the culture. It was the symbols of Britain. The attack began with a rain of fire. The low tide was a disaster for the firefighters. The water pressure in the mains dropped as the pipes were shattered by explosions. They tried to drop suction hoses into the Thames, but the water had receded so far they were sucking mud. London burned. Over 700 acres of the city were set ablaze. This was the second Great Fire of London. Fires raged out of control in the city district. The air was so hot it melted the asphalt in the streets. The bells of St. Clement Danes Church, the oranges and lemons bells of the nursery rhyme, crashed to the ground as the steeple burned. The British Museum was hit. Westminster Abbey was hit. Casualties were horrific. Over 1,400 people were killed in that single night. 12,000 lost their homes. But the most symbolic destruction happened in Westminster. Incendiary bombs fell on the Palace of Westminster. Fire watchers on the roof had to make a terrible choice. They had limited resources. They could save Westminster Hall, the ancient medieval hall, or the chamber of the House of Commons. They chose the hall. The Chamber of the Commons, the room where democracy debated, where Churchill sat, where the laws of the empire were made, was consumed by the flames. The roof collapsed. The green benches were turned to ash. The symbol of British parliamentary democracy was gutted by Nazi fire. The next morning, May 11th, the sun rose over a smoking ruin. Winston Churchill arrived at Westminster. He walked through the debris. The air still smelled of wet char and cordite. He stood in the wreckage of the House of Commons. Churchill was a man of deep sentiment. He loved the traditions of Parliament. He had spent his life in that room. Witnesses say that as he looked at the twisted steel girders and the pile of rubble where the Speaker's chair used to be, he wept. He grasped the arm of an aide. "They have destroyed the House of Commons," he whispered. It felt like a violation. A physical wound to the nation. But then, the tears stopped. The bulldog jaw set. Churchill realized that the Germans had destroyed the building, but they hadn't destroyed the institution. The Parliament would meet. They would meet in the House of Lords. They would meet in the church house. But they would meet. Hitler could burn the wood and stone, but he couldn't burn the Magna Carta. He couldn't burn the concept of freedom. Churchill turned to his staff. "We will rebuild it," he said. And he made a crucial decision. He insisted that it be rebuilt exactly as it was. Small. Intimate. Confrontational. He believed that the architecture of the room shaped the nature of the debate. "We shape our buildings," he would later say, "and afterwards our buildings shape us." He refused to let Hitler change the character of British democracy. But as he walked out of the ruins, Churchill noticed something else. The sky. It was quiet. The bombers had gone. Usually, the Luftwaffe kept up the pressure. They would bomb for nights in a row to prevent the fires from being put out. But the night of May 11th was silent. And the night of May 12th was silent. The sirens didn't wail. The guns didn't fire. Churchill, with his access to the deepest secrets of British intelligence, began to suspect the truth. The destruction of the Commons wasn't the prelude to an invasion. It was a parting shot. The sudden cessation of the Blitz in late May 1941 was confusing to the average Londoner. They waited for the next wave. They slept in their shelters, listening for the drone of the Heinkels. But the sky remained empty. The baby Blitz would continue sporadically, but the nightly armadas were gone. Why? The German propaganda machine claimed they had erased London. They claimed victory. But Churchill knew better. The silence wasn't a sign of German mercy. It was a sign of German distraction. Through the ultra-secret, the breaking of the German Enigma code at Bletchley Park, Churchill was reading the Luftwaffe's movement orders. He saw the squadrons being pulled back from the airfields in France. He saw the trains moving equipment east. He saw the build-up of forces on the border of the Soviet Union. The Germans weren't stopping because they had won. They were stopping because they were moving on to their next victim. Adolf Hitler had grown bored with the stubborn island. He had decided to turn his back on the undefeated British and attack his ally, Joseph Stalin. Operation Barbarossa was about to begin. For Churchill, the silence was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. It meant survival. It meant that the threat of a seaborne invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was officially dead. You can't invade England if your air force is in Russia. It meant that Britain had weathered the storm. They had stood alone against the full might of the Nazi war machine for a year, and they hadn't broken. Churchill looked at the map in his war rooms. He saw the German divisions moving east. He famously remarked to his inner circle, "So, Hitler, is going to attack Russia. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The Blitz was over. The Battle of Britain was won. The Germans had killed 40,000 civilians. They had destroyed millions of homes. But they had failed. Churchill knew that by turning east, Hitler had doomed himself. He had opened a two-front war. The end of the beginning had arrived. The bombs had stopped falling on London, but the clock had started ticking on the 1,000-year eye. While Londoners were sweeping up the glass from the May 10th raid, a different kind of battle was happening in the quiet countryside of Buckinghamshire. At Bletchley Park, the code breakers of Station X were working feverishly. They had broken the German Enigma code, Ultra. They were reading the Luftwaffe's mail. Throughout May 1941, the analysts noticed a strange pattern in the radio traffic. Usually, the Luftwaffe moved units between airfields in France to rest or refit. But now, entire Geschwader, wings, were packing up and leaving. And they weren't going back to Germany for rest. They were moving east. The rail traffic intercepts confirmed it. Massive amounts of aviation fuel, bombs, and spare parts were being shipped to airfields in occupied Poland and Romania. The code breakers traced the movement of Luftflotte 2, one of the two main air fleets bombing Britain. It was being transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the Soviet border. This was the ultra-secret that Churchill held in his hands. It was a revelation of stunning clarity. The Germans weren't just pausing the Blitz, they were abandoning it. They were stripping the Western Front of air cover. The analysts realized the implications immediately. Hitler had given up on the invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion. He had accepted that he couldn't gain air superiority over the Channel. Instead, he was gambling everything on a knockout blow against Russia, Operation Barbarossa. For the British intelligence officers, this was the first ray of hope in a year of darkness. They saw the German timetable. They saw the massive logistical shift. They knew that the terror that had rained down on London was about to rain down on Moscow and Kiev. It was a reprieve bought with the blood of the East End. But it was a secret that had to be kept. If the Germans knew the British were reading their movement orders, they would change the codes. So, the British government had to let the people think the danger was still present, even as the intelligence proved the enemy was walking away. Winston Churchill is often portrayed as the bulldog, defiant, growling, unafraid. But in private, in the spring of 1941, he was a man carrying the weight of the world. He knew that Britain was running out of money. He knew the U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be built. He knew that if Hitler concentrated solely on Britain for another year, the country might starve. Then came the ultra-intercepts. Churchill read the reports in his underground war rooms. He saw the German divisions moving east. The relief was physical. It washed over him. He realized that an invincible German war machine had just made a fatal strategic error. By attacking Russia, Hitler was creating a two-front war, the very thing that had destroyed Germany in 1918. Churchill was a lifelong anti-communist. He hated the Bolsheviks. He had tried to strangle the Soviet Revolution in its cradle in 1919. But he hated Hitler more. He knew that the Red Army, for all its faults, was massive. It would absorb the German blow. It would bleed the Wehrmacht dry. Every German tank destroyed in Russia was a tank that wouldn't be invading Kent. Every bomb dropped on Minsk was a bomb not dropped on Manchester. Churchill famously told his private secretary, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." On June 22, 1941, when the invasion of Russia finally began, Churchill didn't hesitate. He went on the radio. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He pledged full support to Russia. "The Russian danger is therefore our danger," he said. But behind the rhetoric, there was a profound sense of salvation. Britain was no longer alone. The giant had turned its back, and in doing so, it had exposed its neck. In the midst of the strategic pivot, Churchill had to deal with the ruins of British democracy, literally. The House of Commons was a shell. The Parliament was meeting in the House of Lords and later in the Church House. The debate began: how should we rebuild? Many architects and progressive MPs wanted a new, modern chamber. They wanted a semicircular design, like the Congresses in America or Europe. They argued it was more efficient, more democratic. Churchill refused. In a speech in October 1943, he laid out his argument, which remains one of the most profound statements on the relationship between architecture and psychology. "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us," he declared. He insisted that the Commons be rebuilt exactly as it was before, rectangular. Why? Because a semicircle allows a politician to move gradually from left to right. It blurs the lines. A rectangular chamber, with the opposing parties facing each other across a central aisle, forces a decision. You are either for the government, or against it. You have to cross the floor to change sides. It created the adversarial, confrontational style of British politics that Churchill believed was essential for liberty. He also insisted that the chamber remain too small to seat all the members. This meant that during important debates, MPs had to stand in the aisles, crowd together, and shout. Churchill argued that this crowding created a sense of crowd and urgency. It made the debate feel vital. It prevented the atmosphere from becoming sterile and bureaucratic. He was rebuilding the stage for future dramas. He realized that the Blitz had tried to destroy the British way of life by destroying its symbols. By restoring the symbol exactly as it was, flaws and all, he was denying Hitler a cultural victory. The rebuilt House of Commons stands today as a testament to that vision. It is a room designed for a fight, rebuilt by a fighter. Across the Channel, in the airfields of France, the German pilots were packing their bags. They were exhausted. For a year, they had flown against the RAF. They had faced the Spitfires and the Flak. They had flown night missions over burning cities. They had lost thousands of comrades. The cream of the Luftwaffe, the veterans of Spain and Poland, was being thinned out. They were told they were going to a new front. The East. The propaganda told them it would be easy. Kick in the door, Hitler had said. But the pilots knew better. They looked at their planes. The Heinkel 111s and Ju 88s were tired. Their engines were worn out from the strain of carrying heavy loads. The mechanics were fitting dust filters to the intakes. They were painting over the maritime camouflage with forest greens. They were leaving the job unfinished. Every German pilot knew it. They looked across the channel at the white cliffs of Dover. They saw the radar towers still spinning. They saw the RAF patrols still flying. They had dropped 40,000 tons of bombs. They had killed 40,000 people. But they hadn't won. They were leaving an unsinkable aircraft carrier behind them. An island that was rearming, rebuilding, and preparing to host the Americans. By moving the Luftwaffe to Russia, Hitler was committing the ultimate strategic sin. He was fighting a new enemy before he had finished the old one. The Luftwaffe would never recover. It would bleed to death in the Russian winter, while the RAF grew stronger in the safety of its island fortress. The silence over London wasn't peace, it was the sound of the enemy turning away to die elsewhere. The Blitz was a war waged against civilians. But in attempting to break them, Hitler inadvertently created a new kind of army. The civilian army. Before the war, firemen were seen as municipal workers. By May 1941, they were heroes on par with the pilots of the RAF. The Auxiliary Fire Service, AFS, was made up of volunteers, butchers, bakers, clerks, and writers. Every night, they drove their red engines and grey pump trailers into infernos that would have terrified a soldier. They stood on crumbling walls, holding hoses while high explosives fell around them. They dug tunnels into collapsed basements to rescue trapped families. Over 300 firefighters were killed in the Blitz. Thousands were injured. But they held the line. Alongside them were the ARP, air raid precautions, wardens. These were the men and women in the dark blue uniforms and steel helmets labeled W. They patrolled the blacked-out streets. They enforced the light discipline. They spotted the incendiaries. When a firebomb fell, the wardens were the first responders. They used stirrup pumps and sandbags to extinguish the flames before they could spread. The women of the WVS, Women's Voluntary Service, drove mobile canteens, tea wagons, into the bomb sites. They served hot tea and sandwiches to exhausted firefighters and homeless civilians in the middle of the rubble. It seems trivial, but that tea was fuel. It was a symbol of normalcy in a world gone mad. The German plan relied on panic. They expected the Londoners to flee the city, to riot, to demand surrender. Instead, the Londoners organized. They formed neighborhood fire watches. They shared shelters. They developed a dark, stoic humor. Hitler missed me again, they would say, dusting off their coats after a near miss. This resilience was the shield of London. The Luftwaffe could destroy the bricks, but they couldn't destroy the social cohesion. By May 1941, the German High Command realized that terror bombing was a failed concept against the British. They had dropped 40,000 tons of bombs, and the British were still drinking tea and putting out the fires. As the German bombers flew east to Russia, the RAF looked at the empty sky and realized the initiative had passed to them. For a year, Britain had been the anvil. Now, it was time to become the hammer. RAF Bomber Command began to stir. Throughout the Blitz, the British response had been weak. They had raided Berlin, but the damage was negligible. But while London was burning, the British factories were building. They were building the first generation of heavies. The Short Stirling, the Handley Page Halifax, and on the drawing boards, the Avro Lancaster. These were four-engine monsters designed for one purpose: to carry the war to Germany. Churchill was ruthless. He had seen what the Germans did to Coventry and London. He famously said, "They have sown the wind, they shall reap the whirlwind." The end of the Blitz marked the beginning of the strategic bombing offensive. The airfields in East Anglia, which had been defensive fighter bases, began to fill with heavy bombers. The pilots who had watched their cities burn now plotted courses for Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne. It was a grim transition. The British people, who had suffered so much, demanded retaliation. The silence over London in May 1941 was not just the end of the German attack, it was the deep breath before the British counterattack. The Germans had taught the British that strategic bombing could destroy a city. The British learned the lesson well. And unlike the Germans, who were now splitting their air force between two fronts, the British were concentrating everything they had on one target, the Third Reich. The end of the Blitz signaled the death of Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to invade Britain. Hitler had set two conditions for the invasion: air superiority and the demoralization of the population. He achieved neither. The RAF was stronger in May 1941 than it was in July 1940. The population was united behind Churchill. The German invasion barges, gathered in the ports of Calais and Boulogne, were quietly dispersed or left to rot. The unconquerable island had survived. This was the decisive strategic victory of the war in the West. As long as Britain stood, Germany could not win. Britain was the unsinkable aircraft carrier. It was the base from which the US Army would eventually launch D-Day. It was the platform for the bomber offensive. It was the intelligence hub of Bletchley Park. If Britain had fallen, or signed a peace treaty in 1940 or 1941, the world would be a very different place. Hitler's decision to turn east was an admission that he could not solve the British problem. He hoped to conquer Russia quickly and then return to finish Britain off. But by leaving Britain intact at his rear, he doomed himself. He left a dagger pointed at his back. The white cliffs of Dover, which had been the front line, became the fortress wall. The German soldiers on the French coast looked across the Channel with a sense of foreboding. They knew they had missed their chance. They knew that the next time an armada crossed that water, it wouldn't be German. November 1942. The speech was later, but the sentiment belongs to this moment of survival. Churchill addressed the nation. He looked back on the dark days of 1940 and the firestorms of 1941. He knew the war was far from over. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Germans were deep in Russia. But he knew that the existential threat to Britain had passed. He spoke words that defined the era. Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The Blitz was the beginning. It was the test of endurance. The British people had passed the test. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side, soot-stained but standing. The final shot of the documentary shows the ruins of the House of Commons in the moonlight. It is silent. But above it, the Union Jack is still flying on the Victoria Tower. And in the distance, the sound of heavy engines. Not Heinkel's. Halifax's. Heading east. The Blitz was over. The payback had begun.